Alright, so I'm going to talk today about what's new in Rails 4.1. There's been a lot of exciting stuff going on. I'm going to try to go over kind of the most interesting features. But before I get to that, I want to step back a little bit and give everybody kind of an overview of what's been happening in Rails development. And this is just at a pretty high level here. I don't really know the details. But I started by using this git log command that you see here just to see what's changed between version 4.0.0 and 4.1.0. And to summarize, there have been 5,200 commits, which include about 1,500 pull requests. And altogether, that represents the work of 600 different authors. So it's this really huge community effort. There are lots of people putting time into this. And the average person only puts in maybe 100 lines of code. So you can add a few lines of code and contribute to this project. I don't think anybody from the group was in that author list, but someone should correct me if I'm wrong. Altogether, this work that went into 4.1.0 was done as far back as 2012, even though the 4.0.0 release didn't come out until June of last year. So what you should keep in mind is that with Git, there are always these parallel lines of development going on. So there can be people working on things that don't make it into the current release. If they're still working on it, it doesn't get in until finally someone incorporates it. And also the way the Rails development seems to work is that as soon as they get to version 4.0.0 RC1, they split off a branch, which led to 4.1.0. And the 4.0 development line, 4.1 development line were totally divergent. They don't share any commits in common beyond 4.0.0 RC1 release. So I think that means they must be, to get features or bug fixes back from 4.0.0 into 4.1.0, they must be doing a lot of cherry picking or rebasing or something. I don't know exactly how it works. So now I'm going to go over kind of the most interesting features, and I want to warn everybody that I haven't used 4.1.0 at all myself. I haven't used any of the features I'm going to talk about. I haven't even used 4.0 to any significant extent, so please jump in and correct me if I'm wrong about anything. Has anybody tried 4.1.0 at all? Right. I have at least installed it. Cool. So I think the first thing people will notice if they set up a new 4.1.0 Rails app is that it comes by default with the Spring application preloader. And what this is a server that runs in the background. And whenever you run a command like rake or Rails, if you run a Rails generate or you rake your database or something like that, it will go through this server, which means it doesn't have to spend the 2 to 5 seconds that it takes for Rails to start up every time. Now this relies on Rails auto-loading mechanism to notice when your files have changed and update them. So I don't know what everybody's experience has been with that, but I've had a lot of trouble with it in the past.
That's what always works.
So
I have to kill Spring on a regular basis and restart it.
Yeah, so watch out for that. And it was kind of disappointing looking into this a little bit that there's not really any discussion in the documentation yet about how to start Spring, how to stop it, how to debug it when things are going wrong. So be careful.
Yeah, it's set up to start automatically because they put special thin stubs in. But yeah, stopping it, there's no docs.
Okay. I don't even know what it means for it to be started. Where is it? I don't know quite yet. The next thing you'll probably notice is that the sensitive stuff has been taken out of databases.yaml and moved into this config secrets.yaml file. The idea with that is that this file, I think, is supposed to be something that you don't check into source control. It has all of your API keys and your passwords and things like that that you don't want other people to see, so you can keep it more secure. Surprisingly, it is added to source control by default. They did not put it in the git ignore. And I don't think most people are going to be able to keep it out of source control. So for example, if you're deploying to Heroku, there's, as far as I can tell, there's no way to actually get this file to Heroku. So I think you're still stuck. I think people are going to end up just modifying this file to use environment variables the way they used to modify databases.yaml. But maybe there'll be more coming soon. Or maybe people like Heroku will be providing better support for that. Another thing people will notice is action-packed variants. The idea with this is that you can have different versions of your website. So they're kind of supported throughout the system. So you can have your, for example, catalog.html.erb file. You can also have a fancy version of that, catalog.html plus fancy.erb. You can set the variant that's in use within your controller. And there's not a lot of documentation on this, but the main point is for people who want to make mobile sites. So the few examples that they have show how to kind of sniff the user agent to look at whether your user is coming from a tablet or a phone or what, and then redirect them to the, it will choose the appropriate variant of your site based on your device. It's a common thing, lots of people do it. I think it's a really bad idea. So I think it's too complicated. There are too many different kinds of devices, especially these days with tablets getting bigger and phones getting bigger and laptops getting smaller. There are so many different screen resolutions and types of devices that you really should be doing things based on the resolution of your screen and the capabilities of the browser rather than trying to base it off of the user agent. And user agent detection itself is really complicated and confusing, if anybody's ever looked into that. So, but it's something that should be in Rails, and I'm glad it's in there, but I don't think we should be using it. Action mailer previews are pretty cool. So I think up until now, I guess I don't know what everybody else does, but the way I preview my mailers is I look in log files and kind of try to imagine what an email would look like if somebody were to receive it. This bypasses that whole thing and allows you to actually view your mailers in a browser. Suppose people are using webmail anywhere, and you'll see what the email looks like in an actual browser. It seems to set it up pretty nicely. You have to do a little bit of work to get it going because a typical mailer requires some actual data. So you have to set up, you have to say, generate the welcome email for a specific user. You have to make that user somehow and select the user to have it actually display that data. But once you've done that work, it will create this URL for you in development mode where you can go and just browse through all of your mailers and see what they would look like. I would advise anybody who's using this to write a script to kind of download all of that and save it somewhere so that other people who aren't developers can also look at the mailers. Could be useful. Here's what it looks like when you see a mailer. It looks pretty much like an email client without anything more than the email you're looking at. There seems to be a link up here to the plain text version. Oh, and I should mention this was previously this gem called MailView, which people might have used, the 37 signals thing, that is now incorporated into Rails. That seems to be a theme. A kind of interesting feature is having added to active record in Rails 4.1. This is active record enums. And it's a little bit misleading because these do not correspond to database level enums. If you're using a database like Postgres or a lot of databases support built-in enums. In general, enums are ways of having an enumerated list of options. So in this example here, we have two different statuses called active and archived. And internally, they correspond to numbers 0 and 1. But the point is, nobody needs to know the correspondence. You can just work with the names the whole time. And it's a really popular thing in all kinds of programming languages. Supported in databases, this does not use the database support for enums. Instead, what this is doing is using an integer field called status and representing it in Rails as a series of options that are associated to these numbers 0 and 1. And you can see what it does here is it kind of adds a bunch of methods like active question mark to test whether something is in the active status, or active exclamation point to set it into the active status. And it's a little bit weird because you see these don't actually involve the status field. So the idea is these are for things that represent kind of general overall states of your object. And it will get confusing if you try to have several different ones. Like if the object can be active or archived, and it can also be either read or unread. And once you have a few different ones, if you ever have overlapping names, it's going to cause problems. And it'll just get confusing. So don't go crazy with these. And keep in mind that since they're just totally handled by Rails, if you change them at all, if you want to add a new one, you have to be really careful to preserve the order because the information about which name corresponds to which number is not in your database. It's just in your application.
Can you set the representation of them?
You can actually. There's an option. So by default, it just starts with 0 to 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. But if you want to say skip number 2 or change it into some weird order, you can use a hash syntax for specifying exactly which number goes to which one.
You could probably write conversation.status equals active, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And you can use a string or a
Simple.
symbol to do that, I believe. And it might actually work with a database level enum, but it's not intended for that.
This is going to be persisted to your database within a field named status in that table?
But the field is an integer. So
Right.
yeah, it's also interesting that this is in the active record object instead of in some kind of a migration.
We still have to put it in the migration.
You still have to create the status field itself. It's not going to create that field for you. And as soon as you do this, it kind of overrides that field definition so that you can't access the integer value directly anymore. Maybe you can get it through some backdoor, but the main, if you type conversation.status, it's going to return a string or symbol.
Are there state machine type methods like transitioning from one status to another that are built?
I don't think they mentioned that as part of this feature, but I think the normal callbacks would still let you do things. There's another interesting feature. I think this one might be the most useful thing. It's in 4.1, message verifiers. This has always been in Rails. It was in Rails since version 2 or something. And in the past, it was only used for verifying cookies. The idea with the message verifier is that if you want to create some message with your app, like unsubscribe user from email list, be able to prove that that message came from your app without having to save it in a database or something like that. You run it through this message verification, and it kind of appends a hash, a secure hash, that makes it possible for you to check in the future that it was a valid, true message. The main thing that everybody's going to want to use this for is for unsubscribe links. So the idea is you can send an email to a user, it says, click this link to unsubscribe, they click the link, and then it'll unsubscribe them, and it's done securely so that random people can't just unsubscribe everybody on your mailing list. In general, this kind of thing is vulnerable to a kind of attack called a replay attack. If someone else manages to get a hold of that link, they can send it to you themselves, or that person who received it can send it multiple times. So you should be careful and not use it for everything. It's recommended that when you use these kind of things, you add timestamps so that it can expire after a while. And a lot of people are even saying you should salt them with some extra field that is in the database so that as soon as they click on it once, after taking the action, it then updates that field to a new value and refuses to ever do it again. So there are various ways to use this. I think it'll be very useful for a lot of things, but mainly for these unsubscribe links. They have incorporated this thing from a gem called concerning, which is kind of a simple syntax for simplifying complicated classes. So in general, as our classes get bigger and bigger and full of all kinds of junk, at some point you decide you want to clean them up and you want to start ripping out bits of functionality. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. A pretty common approach is to make modules, and a kind of cleaner, lower syntax way to, well, basically this concerning gem is a simple way to define modules that get included into your classes when the modules are only going to be used in that specific class. So in this example here, I'm just going to copy this out of the documentation, but you're inside of a class, you can just say concerning something do, and then you just stick this code in, which is basically the inside of a module, and this ends up incorporating the methods that you defined in that concerning block into your code. I think it's kind of a halfway approach to actually cleaning up your code, because you still have a mess of many different methods within your class, but it at least lets you separate them. And they're pretty happy about being able to do this while keeping everything in the same file without adding a lot of syntax. It's the kind of halfway step to this is the what's it called? The concern. Oh yeah, here.
Yeah, the concerns directory they added at 1.0.
Yeah, so that's something you can include inside of a module that you're defining yourself inside of a class, but you still then have to use the module syntax and then include that module and do a few extra pieces of gymnastics to make everything actually button right. This seems to do it pretty cleanly if you want to do this kind of thing. So another thing, this is going to affect anybody who's doing any kind of AJAX, I think. If you make a request to an action that returns a JavaScript object or a JSON object, even if it's a GET request, it's going to demand CSRF credentials. So this protects against some kind of an attack where somebody is tricking someone else's browser into requesting AJAX, doing an AJAX request to your site. Even if, so normally CSRF protection is just required for posts, but AJAX requests can come in as GETs, and pretty typically they will come in as GETs, or a request for some JavaScript file can come in as a GET. So this just extends it to that, because if you're returning a JavaScript object, you're probably doing some kind of scripting. So it's probably a good idea to keep it protected, so people will have to start providing security tokens for their JavaScript requests. And then this is the last feature I found that was interesting. I think this one is actually pretty exciting. I haven't really looked into the details of how this works, but I think up until now, the way it's worked is that whenever you run your tests, Rails regenerates your test database from your development database by dumping your database to this file structure.sql and then reloading it into the test database, dumping just the structure of the database into that file. And they're changing that now to, instead of doing the dump, as long as you're, what it does now is it just loads that structure.sql file. And as long as you're up to date with your migrations, it won't dump the development database again. I think this is great because this way you can put the file in source control. And then everyone will be on the same version of the file. It won't look at their individual development databases. And instead it'll just be loading it from structure.sql every time. You won't get this thing that we've encountered where everybody kind of gradually diverges and has slightly different things in their development databases, and they're testing on slightly different versions of the database until it becomes a mess and you redo your database from scratch. So I'm excited about that one, but it's still coming out. So overall, there are a lot of exciting new features. I'm a little bit worried about how there's not a lot of documentation on some major things that they're adding, not a lot of motivation being made clear to people. It seems like these are all pretty good things to be getting into the system and see that things are getting cleaned up. So, any questions? Yeah.
Are they changing the default to be structure.sql instead of the schema.rb?
I forget. I might have just made that up because that's what we're doing.
I think it still defaults to schema.rb.
The structure.sql is an option.
Yes.
And just to expand on that, it's kind of funny how over the years, the way that Rails migrations work keeps changing in small, subtle ways. So if you run your migrations in 2009 with Rails whatever, and then you also try to create your database in 2014 by running your Rails migrations, you'll probably get different results.
On long-running projects, you do not want to try to recreate your current database by running your migrations for the last 5 years, because they won't. When you run the migrations that you wrote 5 years ago with today's Rail code, it won't produce the same database that it did when you ran the migration at the time you wrote it originally.
Unless you're extremely careful about updating your old migrations, which nobody wants to do.
And kind of defeats the purpose of.
But with the constant dumping of the development database into this structure file, it's kind of annoying because some of the things that get dumped just change as part of the normal usage of the database, like the auto increment keys. So it's been hard to bring that file into source control, and this should make it a lot easier. Anybody know of anything else that's in 4.1 that I didn't mention? Anything they're excited about coming up soon? Anybody sad about anything not getting in?
Well, overall, this doesn't seem like as big a departure from the previous major version as 3 was from 2, right?
Oh,
I mean,
it's-
we don't have
it's surprising.
something like the asset pipeline, which was just a huge new feature.
Their goals have been to make smaller and smaller releases that change less stuff between them.
They're trying to follow semantic versioning now, aren't they? Or,
Um,
or not?
I don't know if Rails is trying to follow semantic versioning. I'm not positive on that. I know Ruby switched to that, but Rails I'm not convinced.
What does that mean? If you pardon the digression, what's semantic
So
versioning?
if it's, if Rails 4.1 is semantically versioned, then it should be fully backwards compatible with 4.0, and they only made progressive enhancements and added functionality in. And
Well, it's obviously not the case because of all these things like JavaScript, CSR protection. being
yeah,
required.
I don't think that's the case.
I don't think Rails in general makes a strong enough claim about things working that it's going to be able to do that.
Yeah. I can do a quick summary of semantic versioning. So there are these 3 numbers here. So every time you release a new version, obviously change the number, change one of the numbers at least. If you're making things that are backwards incompatible changes, so you're going to break someone else's code, you should change the leftmost number, the major number. If you're adding a new feature that could allow your code to do something it didn't do before, you should, and you're not changing the leftmost number, make sure you change the middle number, which is the minor version number. And if you're just fixing a bug, then if you don't have any reason to change the major or minor number, you just change the revision number. So that's what semantic versioning is. And it's documented, semver.org. Yeah.
All right, well,